Everyone in the neighborhood whispered about her, but no one dared say it to her face. She wasn't like the rest of us, too independent, too stubborn, and most dangerously, too close to the water. Everyone knew water was a luxury here. Control it and you controlled the community, lose it and you were nothing, and she had it. It started on a Tuesday. The sun had barely stretched its first golden fingers across the manicured lawns when a letter arrived, HOA official, stamped and cold. She tore it open with hands that didn't shake, though her chest hammered like it might burst. They had fined her, penalized her, for something as absurd as owning a private water source. Her dam, her small but steady dam that had nourished the backyards for years, suddenly made her an outlaw in her own neighborhood. She remembered staring at the fine notice, the numbers glaring like accusations. $300, $500, $700, escalating each week. She refused to comply. The language was precise, merciless. Violation of community standards, immediate rectification required. They didn't say what would happen if she ignored it, but the threat was in the tone. The threat was in the eyes of the neighbors who had already started to stare. She could hear them sometimes in the distance, whispering by the pool, leaning over cocktail tables, plastic glasses clinking as they plotted the invisible lines she had crossed. They called her selfish, eccentric, dangerous because she had water. Dangerous because she reminded everyone else that life didn't have to be controlled by committees and rules designed to make people feel small. Her first instinct was disbelief. Surely a fine, some complaints, maybe a warning, but this, an orchestrated effort to shame her. She thought about attending the next HOA meeting, sitting in that bright, sterile room with its uncomfortable chairs and fluorescent lights, trying to argue reason with people who had none. But the thought made her chest tight. These people didn't care about reason. They cared about control. At night, she sat by the window, listening to the gentle rush of water over her dam. It was almost hypnotic, the way it flowed, unstoppable yet obedient, bending to her will. She traced her fingers along the cold glass, imagining the looks on the neighbors' faces if she did nothing. If she let them push her into submission, would she lose more than money? Would she lose herself? The first confrontation came quietly in the guise of civility. Mrs., with her perfectly coiffed hair and too bright smile, knocked on her door one morning, holding a tray of freshly baked muffins like an olive branch. "We just want to talk," she said, voice sweet but edged with venom. "We're concerned about the safety of your dam, the children, the neighborhood." She smiled politely. She didn't laugh. She didn't cry. Inside, something dark and unspoken stirred. They didn't care about safety. They cared about her compliance. She offered them tea, listened to the rehearsed lines, nodded at the predictable suggestions. Lower the water, cap the dam, apologize for existing. By the time Mrs. left, the tray empty, the words still lingered in the air. "We all want harmony." Harmony meant control. Harmony meant submission. And she refused. That night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the party coming this weekend. Mrs. had been planning it for months. A celebration of community spirit, whatever that meant. Crystal glasses, floral arrangements, laughter like a rehearsed symphony. She imagined them, oblivious to the real stakes, prancing in their dresses and suits, thinking they were safe, thinking the world was theirs. But the water, her water, flowed silently, gathering strength, a hidden force beneath their feet. A spark ignited in her chest. She wasn't just going to resist the fines, the whispers, the indignities. She was going to remind them in a way they would never forget that she existed and that some things weren't theirs to command. Not money, not opinion, not life itself. As the wind rustled the leaves and the first stars began to prick the night sky, she made a decision. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't angry. It was inevitable. If they wanted a show of power, she would give them one, but on her terms. The water had been patient, quiet, faithful, and now it would speak. She closed her eyes, imagining the ripples, the sudden rush, the look on their faces when the dam opened. It wasn't about revenge. Not really. It was about freedom, about dignity, about showing a community built on rules that only served the loudest voices, that the smallest ones could still roar. And when she finally opened her eyes, the decision had settled into her bones like a promise. The fine letters, the polite threats, the smug parties, they had underestimated her. They didn't know the quiet power that waited behind a steady hand and a dam full of water. And they never would. Why did she feel a thrill of fear mixed with exhilaration that night? It wasn't just the threat of fines anymore. It was the entire neighborhood, every perfectly trimmed hedge, every sparkling window, every whispering neighbor, watching her. And she could almost feel it. The invisible lines they drew around her life, the way they measured obedience like a ruler pressed against her spine. The days leading to the party were a tense, silent war. Every morning she walked past her neighbors, faces polite, masks of civility hiding sharp edges. They nodded, smiled, asked about the weather, never mentioning the letters, never admitting the war simmering beneath the surface. But she felt it in every sideways glance, every twitch of an eyebrow. The water in her dam seemed to pulse with her heartbeat, a secret ally waiting, patient, calm. One afternoon, a delivery truck rolled up carrying garden supplies. She watched the driver glance at her house, then over at the manicured lawns of the other homes. Curiosity flickered across his face, a silent acknowledgement of the tension she carried like a second skin. She offered him water, a gesture of normalcy, but he hesitated. Something about her presence made him pause, as if he sensed she belonged to a different rhythm than the rest of the neighborhood. The HOA escalated their threats. Notices slid under her door, email chains that demanded compliance, phone calls at odd hours. They accused her of endangering the community, of flaunting the rules, of being a hazard. Every message tried to shrink her, to box her into the corner where polite people lived. She read them all, crumpled some, filed others neatly in a drawer. But none of them touched her resolve. In the evenings, she stood at the edge of her dam, letting the cool water rush past her fingers, imagining what the weekend would bring. Mrs. Party wasn't just a gathering, it was a stage. A stage for their superiority, their smugness, their perfect lives and sparkling facades. And she would walk onto that stage in a way they would never forget. The neighbors had no idea what patience she had cultivated over years of solitude, of quiet defiance. They only saw the surface. A woman alone with her property, refusing to bend. They didn't see the meticulous care she poured into the dam, the late nights ensuring the gates held, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that when she needed it, the water would obey her. The night before the party, she barely slept. Her mind raced through the plans, not reckless, not cruel, but precise. Each scenario played in her head. The water, once released, rushing into the lowlands, cascading through the lawns, touching every corner of the community that had tried to diminish her. She imagined Mrs. Face, forced smiles cracking, the glittering glasses tumbling into puddles. She imagined whispers turning to shouts, laughter replaced by the sound of rushing water and stunned silence. And yet, beneath it all, there was a quiet sorrow. Not for herself, never for herself, but for the community she had once hoped could be more than a rigid hierarchy of control. There had been a time when she believed in neighbors, in kindness, in shared trust. Now she understood the truth. Some people weren't built to share anything, not even air, not even water. And sometimes, the only way to claim your dignity was to remind them that it wasn't theirs to take. She walked the perimeter of her property one last time, checking the mechanisms, feeling the cool metal under her hands, listening to the water's gentle roar. It was a private conversation between her and the world. No witnesses, no judgment, only anticipation. The water was ready. She was ready. And the neighborhood, blind in its confidence, was not ready for what was coming. By the first light of the party morning, a peculiar tension had settled across the community. Neighbors bustled in designer dresses and crisp shirts, arranging chairs, lighting candles, adjusting flower arrangements as though they could arrange reality itself. Music floated across lawns, cheerful, oblivious. They had no idea of the storm quietly held in her hands, no inkling of the dam that had become more than just a source of water. It was her voice, her statement, her unyielding proof that some things could not be taken without consequence. Her phone buzzed with a final HOA warning. She read it, smiled softly, and placed it aside. The words seemed trivial against the silent promise held in the water. Sometimes, she thought, people only understood lessons when they felt them, when they could no longer ignore the truth. And this community, so obsessed with rules, appearances, and control, was about to feel it. As she sipped her tea, watching the morning sun glint off the dam, she felt a calm she hadn't felt in years. Not arrogance, not vindictiveness, but clarity. The time for waiting was over. The time for silence was over. The dam had waited. She had waited. And soon the delicate world of polite facades and whispered judgments would have to reckon with the reality that sometimes those who seem quiet are the ones holding the most power. And in that quiet, serene moment, she realized something profound. Power, true power, was not about dominating others. It was about owning yourself. And as the music floated faintly from the streets beyond, she knew she was ready to remind them all. The music was louder than she expected. It drifted over the fence, over her carefully kept lawns, over the dam that hummed quietly in anticipation. Crystal glasses clinked in perfect rhythm with polite laughter. The neighbors had transformed the street into a picture of perfection. Flowers, candles, sparkling dresses, and suits pressed so sharply they seemed to cut the sunlight. They had no idea she was watching, no idea what was quietly gathering behind her house. Why did it make her chest ache so much, the sight of them celebrating as if nothing mattered? She hadn't hated them at first. She tried to fit in, to smile, to nod, to play their game. But it was impossible. The rules were never for everyone. They were for her, for the quiet ones, for anyone who dared to hold a little more than the neighborhood deemed acceptable. And she held the water. She held her own dignity. That was enough to make her a target. She stood behind the gate, feeling the weight of the metal in her hands. The dam's surface rippled faintly, catching the morning light. She ran her fingers over the latch, the cold bite of steel grounding her. This was no longer a decision, it was inevitability. Years of small indignities, letters, whispered warnings, polite threats, all of it had led to this moment. And the water, her quiet ally, waited with her, patient, relentless, unstoppable if released. Across the street, Mrs. laughed at something someone had said. A perfectly rehearsed laugh, full of sweetness and thinly veiled superiority. She raised her glass as though offering a toast to the universe itself, completely unaware of the storm that would soon sweep across her carefully constructed illusion. Every detail of this party screamed control, safety, harmony. And that's why she had to break it. The first step was simple, almost gentle. She moved toward the dam, heart steady despite the adrenaline thrumming through her veins. She inspected the gate, the mechanism that held back the quiet flood of water that had nourished her land for years. Her hands trembled, not from fear, not from anger, but from the enormity of what she was about to do. This wasn't petty revenge. It wasn't malice. It was truth in motion, the consequence of being forced to live in a world that refused to recognize her rights. She imagined their faces as the first surge of water would hit the lower yards. The elegant dresses plastered to skin, the hair drenched, the laughter cut short. She imagined them screaming, running, scrambling to save their delicate tables and trays of food. And in the same breath, she felt a pang of something she couldn't name. Not cruelty, not pride, something quieter. A reminder that people, even those who oppressed you, were human, fragile, mortal. That knowledge made her resolve sharper. The lesson had to be undeniable. The neighbors were oblivious. Music and laughter carried through the street, mingling with the scent of flowers and the warm hum of social superiority. They had been planning this party for months, arranging every detail with meticulous care. And here she was, a single person holding the balance of power in her hands, standing behind a dam that had never failed her. The irony wasn't lost on her. They had built their world of control on appearances. She had built hers on reality. A child ran past, chasing a balloon that had slipped free from the decorations. She watched him pause at the edge of the street, pointing at something invisible. Maybe it was the wind, maybe it was the way the water lapped faintly at the dam. He smiled, then ran back to his parents, oblivious to the tension coiled just beyond the fence. She felt a flicker of guilt. She wasn't careless. She wasn't reckless. But consequences had a way of being larger than intention. She reminded herself, she wasn't breaking the water for fun. She was reminding a community that control without respect is meaningless. The minutes stretched, each one heavier than the last. She imagined the first ripple, the first rush, the first reaction of her neighbors as reality intruded on their perfect illusion. The sound of water would drown their laughter, soak their food, sweep away the decor carefully chosen to impress. And then silence, the kind of silence that leaves people thinking, leaves them reconsidering, leaves them remembering. And yet, as she stood there, hand on the latch, heart racing, she realized something. This was bigger than anyone imagined. Not just for her, not just for the party. This was a statement, a testament, a reckoning. It was about dignity, about claiming space in a world that constantly tried to erase it. It was about teaching everyone, herself included, that some things couldn't be fined, couldn't be controlled, couldn't be erased. She took a deep breath. The water shimmered below, reflecting the sun in patterns that seemed almost alive. She felt the weight of every insult, every fine, every whisper. And then she made the choice, not reckless, not angry, decisive. The latch shifted under her fingers, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement, but it was enough. The dam waited. She waited. And beyond the fences, the music played on, the laughter continued, the neighbors oblivious to the inevitability gathering behind them. The first drop fell quietly, almost innocuous, a small bead of water escaping the latch, glinting in the sunlight, unnoticed by the neighbors who were too busy smiling, talking, toasting, arranging their picture-perfect party. She watched it, heart pounding not from fear but from the weight of inevitability. The water had been patient for years. Now it was speaking. She shifted the latch further, just enough for a trickle to become a stream. The sound was soft at first, a whispering promise of what was to come. The ripples caught on the sunlight, turning the water into a ribbon of molten silver winding its way toward the edge of the lawn. Somewhere in the distance, a child's laughter floated over the fence, high and carefree, oblivious to the storm, quietly moving closer. Then it accelerated. The gentle trickle became a rush, and the rush became a roar. The water surged over the edges of the dam, hungry and unstoppable, following the contours of the land. She felt it against her boots, cold and real, and a thrill of both fear and triumph shot through her. This was no longer hypothetical. This was power, tangible and immediate, flowing freely under her control. Across the street, the first victims of her quiet rebellion noticed the change. A puddle formed under the elegant tables, creeping with purpose. A crystal glass tipped, tumbling into the water, sending a tiny spray across the white tablecloth. Someone shrieked, a sharp, piercing sound that made her stomach twist, but she did not move. She let it happen. She had to. They had to understand. Mrs. turned, confusion creasing her perfectly sculpted brow. She didn't see the dam, didn't see the source. She only saw the water reaching her heels, felt the chill creeping up her polished shoes. "What?" she began, voice high and panicked. The words were swallowed by the roar of the flood. She stumbled backward, clutching at a chair for balance, her face twisted in shock, disbelief, and rage. The neighbors scrambled, elegant dresses and suits becoming absurd and tragic in their wetness. Plates of food floated like miniature rafts, silverware bobbing helplessly. Laughter died mid-sentence, replaced by shouting, splashing, the unmistakable sound of chaos encroaching on their carefully curated perfection. For a moment, she watched in quiet awe, not cruelty, not vindictiveness. Awe, the raw force of something undeniable, uncontainable breaking through the polite veneer of their lives. And then the children screamed. She flinched at the sound, a sharp, piercing alarm that reminded her of responsibility. They were scared. Some slipped in the shallow flood, tiny legs flailing, parents grabbing at them in panicked instinct. She ran to the edge, directing the flow subtly, guiding it so no one would be hurt. Her hands trembled, not from the cold water, but from the enormity of her own control, the realization that what she had done was irreversible, yet precise. She could see Mrs. now, soaked from head to toe, hair plastered to her face, voice cracking as she shouted at neighbors, at the sky, at her invisible enemy. The meticulously arranged tables were ruined, decorations floating away, petals dissolving into the sudden torrent. The party had dissolved into a tableau of chaos, an elegant nightmare painted with water and shock. Somewhere in the back, a man tried to salvage the food, lifting trays high, but the water claimed them faster than he could react. Others tried to herd children to safety, slipping in the mud, struggling to maintain composure as the illusion of control dissolved with every passing second. She could feel their panic as though it were a living thing, a mirror of her own years of feeling powerless in a world of rules she never asked to play by. And yet, amidst the chaos, she felt a strange serenity. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't triumph in the shallow sense. This was truth manifesting, consequences arriving for those who had tried to punish her for claiming what was hers. The water didn't discriminate, but she had guided it carefully. The moral was in the precision, in the inevitability, in the way nature and justice sometimes moves quietly until it can't be ignored. Mrs. finally looked up at her across the rising flood, eyes wide, lips trembling. She wanted words, an explanation, an apology, a reason, but none came. Words were meaningless in the presence of action, in the presence of power she had always taken for granted. For the first time, the neighbors saw her, not as a quirky outsider, not as a target for fines, not as a woman with a dam, but as a force. Quiet, deliberate, unstoppable. She lingered a moment longer, watching the chaos unfold, listening to the sudden quiet and the screams that were swallowed by water. Then, with a subtle movement, she released the remaining tension in the latch. The water surged fully, moving with grace and inevitability, washing across lawns, nudging fences, reminding the neighborhood of its fragility. And in that moment, standing alone, soaked by spray and the enormity of her own actions, she understood something profound. Dignity isn't loud. Power isn't violent by nature. Sometimes the strongest statement is a quiet one, carried in the unyielding flow of what you already own. And for the first time in years, she felt a sense of equilibrium, a balance restored, not just in the water, but in herself. The street smelled of wet grass, upturned soil, and fear. Water lapped at the foundations of houses, soaking the immaculate lawns and dismantling the illusion of control the neighborhood had held so tightly. The party was over, though no one admitted it yet. Chairs were toppled, trays of food floated in miniature lakes, and the air rang with stunned, frantic voices. She stood at the edge of her property, soaked, boots muddy, and for the first time in a long while, completely calm. Why did no one come for her? The answer was simple. They didn't know what to do. Their world of rules, fines, polite conversations, and orchestrated complaints had been shattered in moments by a reality they couldn't contain. They had treated her as a problem to be managed, and now they were confronted with proof that some things, water, dignity, life, were beyond control. Mrs. emerged from the chaos, hair plastered to her face, dress soaked, eyes wide. Her voice cracked as she called her name, but it sounded strange in the roar of dripping water and shouting neighbors. "How, why, what did you do?" The words stumbled out, fragmented, powerless. She didn't answer. There was no explanation that could capture the weight of years of frustration, the countless letters, the polite threats, the whispers behind fences. Words were useless now. Only presence mattered. Neighbors slowly gathered along their fences, dripping in wet clothes, shoes squelching in the mud, expressions ranging from fear to disbelief to awe. They whispered to each other, pointing at the flood, at the ruined tables, at the woman who had dared to defy them. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others looked at her with a strange mixture of respect and fear. And she felt something she hadn't anticipated, a flicker of satisfaction, not petty revenge, not gloating, but a deep, quiet assertion that she belonged. That her voice, her actions, her right to exist mattered. Children, some crying, some laughing at the absurdity, tugged at parents' sleeves, asking questions they couldn't yet articulate. The adults were too stunned to respond adequately, so she bent down to their level. Her voice was calm, soothing, human. "It's okay," she said. "You're safe, that's what matters." Even in the chaos, she chose care. Power without compassion, she thought, is just destruction, and she wanted more than destruction. She wanted recognition, understanding, the lesson that control isn't ownership, and that rules meant to diminish others are hollow at best. Some neighbors tried to confront her, approaching hesitantly, voices trembling between anger and incredulity. "You could have hurt someone. Do you have any idea what you've done? This is vandalism, a crime." But their words fell flat against the calm she had cultivated over months of threats, letters, and planning. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The flood, the ruined party, the shocked faces, those were her answers. Action, she realized, carries clarity words often cannot. She wandered through the aftermath, careful not to step where water pooled dangerously, observing the destruction she had orchestrated. It was precise, controlled. No one was seriously hurt. The chaos had meaning. The lesson was undeniable, and yet she felt a pang of sorrow for what had been lost, not her loss, but the innocence of the community, the illusion that life could always be neat and predictable. It couldn't. It never could. A few neighbors lingered, finally breaking through the shock with muted apologies, half-hearted explanations, and awkward attempts at reconciliation. She listened but said little. Her silence was deliberate. She didn't need approval. She didn't need forgiveness. She needed recognition that her rights, her choices, and her dignity could not be bargained away, could not be fined into oblivion. And in that silence, she felt a strange liberation, as if the water had not only reshaped the street, but also the boundaries of what she would tolerate in life. By the evening, the floodwaters had begun to recede. Mud and debris clung to every surface, reminders of the day's events. The street, once pristine and orderly, now bore evidence of chaos, humility, and truth. Mrs., finally gathering her composure, avoided her gaze. Other neighbors muttered apologies, excuses, and nervous laughter, unsure how to reconcile the woman who had been eccentric with the undeniable power she had just wielded. She returned to her dam, standing at the edge as the last of the water settled into its natural course. She ran her hands through it, feeling the cold flow, the quiet hum of persistence, the way it obeyed her because she had nurtured it, not because anyone had demanded compliance. The flood had been a message, a statement, a reminder that some things are beyond control and that dignity often requires action, even when it terrifies others. As darkness fell, the street smelled of wet soil, crushed petals, and lingering tension. The neighborhood had been humbled, unsettled, but she felt a profound calm settle in her chest. She hadn't just defended her property, she had defended herself. She had reminded the world in a subtle but undeniable way that silence, patience, and quiet strength carry weight. And that weight, when finally released, has the power to change everything. The morning after was eerily quiet. The street smelled of wet earth, crushed flowers, and the faint scent of panic still clinging to the air. Where once there had been music, laughter, and polite chatter, there was only the dripping of water from broken awnings, the soft squelch of mud underfoot, and the occasional hum of a neighbor cautiously testing the stability of their ruined lawn chairs. She walked slowly along the edge of her property, boots sinking slightly in the mud, and felt an unfamiliar weight, anticipation. The world was holding its breath. Letters arrived in the following days, formal, polite, and trembling with thinly veiled indignation. Fines escalated, threats grew sharper, and whispers filled the street like a persistent fog. The HOA called meetings, convened emergency councils, sent committees to inspect the damage. But the truth remained stubbornly undeniable. She had the water, she had the power, and they had been humbled. No amount of paperwork, signatures, or polite insistence could change that. Neighbors treated her differently now. Some avoided her entirely, heads bowed, conversations paused mid-word when she walked past. Others lingered awkwardly, curious, hesitant, glances flicking to her with a strange mixture of fear and respect. Children who had once run past her fence without thought now paused, peering at her with awe. She noticed it, felt it, but said nothing. Power is not declared, it is understood. Mrs., once untouchable in her self-appointed reign of social order, stopped holding gatherings for months. Invitations that would have flowed freely now trickled through reluctant hands, hesitant and uncertain. The meticulously planned, community spirit events were replaced by tentative meetings, awkward apologies, and a pervasive awareness that the rules they had relied upon were fragile, that the world they had built on appearances could collapse when confronted with quiet determination and undeniable fact. And yet in the quiet aftermath she felt a twinge of melancholy. It was not regret, never that, but a deep, reflective sorrow for what had been lost. The community had once held potential, a place where neighbors could support one another, share laughter, and build trust. But they had traded integrity for appearances, kindness for conformity. In their pursuit of control, they had forgotten the simple truth: respect cannot be demanded, it must be earned. She spent hours by the dam, watching the water settle into its familiar rhythm, listening to the soft hum of life flowing steadily, untroubled by letters, fines, or whispers. In the flowing water she found clarity. Life is rarely fair, she realized, and people rarely act justly, but dignity is a choice, a commitment to oneself rather than to the expectations of others. She had exercised that choice, and it had been messy, chaotic, and necessary. The neighborhood slowly adapted. Some tried to rebuild, restoring lawns, repairing fences, arranging cautious gatherings. But the memory of that day lingered like a shadow, a quiet reminder that control is illusion, that appearances are fragile, and that one person, armed with patience, intelligence, and resolve, can shift the balance in ways no committee can undo. Letters continued to arrive, increasingly desperate. Legal threats, demands for compensation, formal complaints claiming negligence. She read them calmly, filing them in a drawer she rarely opened. There was no anger in her response, no need. Words had failed the neighbors once, and they would fail them again. Some lessons must be learned the hard way, and she was content to let reality carry the teaching. And in the quiet, she found a strange satisfaction. Not from triumph, not from seeing them humbled, but from the simple fact of her own integrity. She had acted according to her principles, defended what was hers, and asserted her place in the world without losing herself. The water had been patient, and so had she. Together, they had reminded a community that obedience is not the same as respect, that power is not the same as righteousness, and that dignity is more valuable than any fine, any party, any whispered complaint behind manicured hedges. She often thought about Mrs., about the neighbors, about the people who had once laughed at her for standing alone. And she understood something quiet, almost painful. People rarely change unless forced, rarely understand unless shown. The flood had done more than soak lawns. It had shifted perspectives, revealed truths, and exposed the fragile foundations of a community built on fear and appearances. At night, she stood by the water, listening to its soft flow, reflecting on the events and the weeks that followed. She realized that true strength is quiet, steady, and patient. It does not boast. It does not demand acknowledgement. It simply exists, shaping the world through consistent presence and deliberate action. And when the world finally notices, it is too late to ignore it. In the long term, she found peace in the rhythm of her life, the certainty of the water, and the knowledge that she had acted not out of malice, but out of necessity, dignity, and self-respect. And in that calm, reflective moment, she understood the enduring truth. Power is not what you take. It is what you claim for yourself, quietly, deliberately, and with unwavering resolve. The days turned into weeks, and the neighborhood felt different, though no one said it aloud. The air carried a subtle tension, like a wound slowly healing but never quite forgetting the pain that created it. People moved more cautiously, spoke more softly, laughed less loudly. There was a weight in their eyes whenever they saw her, a mix of respect, fear, and something more complicated, grudging acknowledgement. She existed on their minds now, whether they admitted it or not. It struck her one morning as she walked along the edge of her property that she had become an anomaly, a living reminder of what it meant to be unyielding. Children peeked at her from behind fences, curiosity mingling with awe, their parents whispering reassurances they didn't fully understand. She smiled quietly at them, knowing that influence isn't always loud or visible. Sometimes it flows silently, like the water in her dam, shaping perception without force, leaving an impression that lingers far longer than a shouted warning ever could. Mrs. avoided her entirely now, retreating into meticulously curated seclusion, her social events canceled or quietly abandoned. She could still see the woman's reflection in the glass of her own windows sometimes, pristine, frustrated, angry, but no longer defiant in public. And with that absence came a strange sort of clarity. Victory had never been about humiliation. It had been about acknowledgement, respect, and the quiet power of self-possession. Yet even as the neighborhood adapted, she felt a weight in her chest that wasn't pride. It was reflection, deep and quiet. She thought about the chaos, the fear, the panic, the splashing water, the overturned tables, the damp dresses and polished shoes sinking into mud. No one had been seriously hurt, and yet the event had transformed the community. Transformation carries its own cost. She understood that even righteous actions leave marks, even when the intent is pure. Neighbors began approaching her carefully, cautiously. Some brought flowers, hesitant apologies, awkward attempts at reconciliation. Others simply nodded in passing, silently acknowledging her presence, her strength, her quiet dominance of circumstance. And she accepted none of it outwardly. The acknowledgement she sought had already been earned through action, not through words or gifts. True recognition, she realized, is undeniable and doesn't need verbal reinforcement. One afternoon, she found herself reflecting on the letters, the meetings, the whispers that had once surrounded her. How strange it was that people could spend years plotting, judging, policing, all while ignoring the obvious. Some people cannot be contained. Some forces, like water, cannot be forever without consequence. And in that quiet realization, she felt something profound. Patience, when paired with resolve, is a form of power far more enduring than anger, far more effective than punishment. She returned often to the edge of the dam, watching the water move in steady rhythm, listening to its soft murmur, thinking about the lessons it carried. Not all lessons are taught with kindness. Not all truths are gentle. And yet they endure. They shape the world in ways that outlast fear, gossip, and the ephemeral rules people cling to. In the calm, reflective moments, she understood that she had acted with a deliberate moral clarity, one that her neighbors had only begun to comprehend. The community, slowly and awkwardly, began to rebuild. They cleaned their yards, repaired fences, and restored lawns, but the shift in their demeanor was permanent. Control was no longer absolute. Appearances no longer masked the fragility of their order. They had learned painfully that some boundaries exist beyond committee rules, that respect cannot be bought or forced, and that dignity is a quiet, resolute choice that must be acknowledged, even if reluctantly. She walked through the neighborhood sometimes, observing the tentative reconciliation among her neighbors, the cautious new respect in their eyes. They didn't understand fully, and perhaps they never would. But she didn't need them to. Recognition is not always about others. It is about knowing your own strength, your own values, and your own capacity to act with integrity when no one else will. And in the quiet of twilight, standing by the dam, listening to the steady, calming flow, she finally allowed herself to breathe. There was no triumph in the chaos, no arrogance in the assertion of power. There was simply presence, patience, and dignity, the quiet truths that had guided her all along. She understood now completely that the flood had been more than an act of defiance. It had been a statement of existence, a reminder that some forces, some people, cannot be controlled, contained, or silenced. And in that knowledge, she found peace, a steady, unwavering peace that no letter, no fine, no social hierarchy could ever disturb. The neighborhood had changed, though it was quiet, almost imperceptible at first. People moved differently now, with a careful awareness that hadn't existed before. They spoke with caution, laughter tempered, gestures measured. It wasn't fear exactly, not the trembling panic of the day the water surged, but a deep recognition that their world had limits and that some forces, no matter how small they seemed, were beyond control. She walked through her property one morning, the sunlight sparkling across the steady surface of her dam. The water flowed as it always had, patient, faithful, untouchable. She traced her fingers along the edge, listening to its soft murmur, and felt the calm certainty that comes from acting with integrity. Years of fines, whispers, and threats had brought her here to this clarity. Dignity cannot be fined, control cannot be demanded, and power, when quiet and deliberate, speaks louder than any committee, any party, any orchestrated display of superiority. Neighbors waved hesitantly as she passed, tentative acknowledgement in their gestures. Some avoided eye contact, still wary of the woman who had upended their carefully curated world. Others met her gaze directly, subtle nods that carried more meaning than words ever could. They understood now that she was not just a homeowner, not just a problem for the HOA to manage. She was someone who had claimed her space, her rights, and her voice, and refused to yield when others demanded compliance for the sake of appearances. Mrs. never spoke to her directly again. She retreated behind manicured hedges, perfect houses, and meticulously planned events that no longer occurred. In her absence, a quiet lesson settled over the street. Authority, when divorced from respect and compassion, is fragile. Rules meant to suppress will always meet resistance. Patience will eventually assert itself, and dignity, once acted upon, cannot be erased. Yet even as the neighborhood healed physically, lawns restored, fences rebuilt, mud washed away, the emotional landscape remained altered. People whispered more cautiously. They measured their judgments, recalibrated their expectations, and learned to treat what they had once dismissed with care. And she, standing by her dam, watched it all unfold with a serenity that came from knowing she had not just acted, but acted rightly. She thought often of the flood, the sudden, unstoppable surge of water that had ripped through their illusion of control. Not with malice, not with cruelty, but with precision, patience, and inevitability. It had been a message, and messages are lasting not because of volume, but because of truth. The water had taught them something they could not have learned from letters, warnings, or polite discussions. Some things must be experienced to be understood. Children still ran past her property, curious and cautious. They no longer feared the woman behind the dam. Some even waved, their innocence untouched by the lessons carried by adults. She smiled quietly at them, feeling the gentle ripple of hope. Change, after all, often arrives through observation, not instruction. And in the quiet, she realized that she had not only protected herself, but had shaped a new awareness in those around her. A recognition that courage, patience, and quiet determination matter more than appearances or superficial compliance. At night, she stood at the edge of the dam, listening to the water glide over rocks and edges, calm and unhurried. The neighborhood lights twinkled faintly in the distance, warm and familiar, but now shadowed by humility and understanding. She allowed herself to reflect on what had occurred, the chaos, the fear, the astonishment, the subtle transformation that followed. She understood, finally, that power is not in domination, control, or fear. It is in the deliberate assertion of what is rightfully yours, in acting with clarity when others would demand silence, and in patience when others rush toward judgment. The lessons were simple yet profound. Respect cannot be demanded. Dignity cannot be fined away. And patience, when paired with resolve, is stronger than any social order, stronger than fear, stronger than the illusion of control. She had lived it, proven it, and in doing so had changed not just her world, but the subtle course of the world around her. As the last light faded and the stars emerged above her property, she closed her eyes and let the sound of the water fill the space where tension, fear, and judgment once lingered. She felt at peace, not triumphant, not vengeful, but steady, grounded, whole. The neighborhood had learned its lesson. She had learned hers. And in that quiet, unspoken understanding, the story found its resolution, not in chaos, not in punishment, but in the enduring power of dignity, courage, and deliberate action. She smiled softly. Some forces, like water, cannot be contained forever, and sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding the most power. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next mystery on HOA Hunter Stories.